Welcome to our journey through one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, the Black Death. Imagine, if you will, a world shrouded in fear, where a mysterious illness sweeps across continents, leaving devastation in its wake. In the 14th century, Europe faced such a terror. In this video, we'll explore the origins, spread and impact of the plague that swept through Europe in the 14th century. We will delve into the conditions that allowed it to thrive, the impact it had on medieval society, and the indelible mark it left on human history. The year is 1347, a year that would mark the beginning of one of the darkest periods in human history. A shadow falls over Europe, a shadow that would bring untold suffering and change the continent forever. A creeping terror, arriving on ships from the east, carried unknowingly by sailors and merchants. This is no ordinary foe, it is the Black Death, a plague unlike any seen before, a harbinger of death and despair. From its origins in Central Asia, it journeyed along trade routes carried by fleas that infested rodents, themselves unwitting passengers on merchant vessels. These trade routes, once symbols of prosperity, now became conduits of death. By the time the first victims succumbed in the bustling port city of Messina, Sicily, the plague had already begun its deadly campaign across the continent, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. Imagine the fear that must have gripped the hearts of medieval citizens as the plague relentlessly spread. The sense of dread was palpable as entire communities were decimated. From Italy, it snaked its way north, reaching France, Spain, and England within a few short years. No corner of Europe was spared from its deadly grasp. The speed at which it moved was staggering, facilitated by a lack of understanding of the disease and the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions prevalent in medieval cities. These conditions created a perfect breeding ground for the plague. The Black Death was ruthless, indiscriminate in its choice of victims. It did not matter who you were or where you came from, rich and poor, young and old. All fell prey to its invisible hand. The social fabric of Europe was torn apart as families and communities were decimated. Within just 5 years, from 1347 to 1351, the plague had reshaped the demographic landscape of Europe. Entire regions were depopulated, and the survivors were left to pick up the pieces. It's estimated that a third of the continent's population, a staggering 25 million souls, perished in its wake. The sheer scale of the death toll is almost unimaginable. The Black Death was not merely a moment in time, it was a watershed event, a cataclysm that irrevocably altered the course of history. Societies were thrown into chaos, and the old ways of life were forever changed. The world that emerged from the shadow of the plague was a world transformed, forever marked by the trauma of mass death and the societal upheaval it wrought. The survivors had to rebuild their lives in a changed world, one that would never be the same again. To truly understand the devastation of the Black Death, we must delve into the microscopic world of the culprit, the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This tiny, rod-shaped bacterium is the unseen enemy that changed the course of history. This tiny organism, invisible to the naked eye, wreaked havoc on a continental scale. It spread fear and death across Europe, leaving no corner untouched. It traveled within the bodies of fleas, themselves parasites on the black rat, a common sight in medieval towns and villages. These rats were everywhere, from the poorest hovels to the grandest castles. The rats, drawn to human settlements by the abundance of food and shelter, became unwitting vectors of the plague. They thrived in the filth and squalor of medieval life. As they scurried through homes, markets, and streets, the fleas they carried jumped onto humans, transmitting the deadly bacteria through their bites. Each bite was a potential death sentence. The living conditions of the time, with their poor sanitation, overcrowding, and lack of proper waste disposal, created a perfect breeding ground for rats and fleas, accelerating the spread of the plague. The streets were often filled with waste, attracting more rats. Imagine the bustling markets of a medieval city, overflowing with goods and people. These markets were the lifeblood of the city, but also a hub for the spread of disease. Unbeknownst to them, rats scurried beneath the stalls, their fur teeming with infected fleas. Every corner of the market was a potential hotspot for the plague. A bite from one of these tiny insects could spell a death sentence. The bite would often go unnoticed until it was too late. The plague spread like wildfire through these densely populated areas, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. Entire families were wiped out and cities were brought to their knees. The Black Death was not just a biological phenomenon, it was a social one. It changed the very fabric of society, altering the course of history. The conditions of medieval life, with its lack of hygiene and medical understanding, facilitated the rapid spread of the plague. People had no idea how to combat this invisible enemy. The very fabric of society, with its close-knit communities and constant movement of people, contributed to the devastating reach of the Black Death. The plague knew no boundaries, affecting rich and poor alike. Chapter 3. A Cruel Affliction. Symptoms of the Black Death. The Black Death was a terrifying and merciless disease, manifesting in several forms, each more horrific than the last. The most common form, bubonic plague, announced its presence with agonizingly swollen lymph nodes called buboes that grew to the size of oranges in the groin, armpits, and neck. These grotesque swellings, filled with pus and blood, were excruciatingly painful and often oozed a foul-smelling discharge. As the disease progressed, victims were racked with fever, chills, headaches, and muscle pain. Their bodies, ravaged by the infection, were covered in black boils and gangrenous sores. The stench of death clung to them, a macabre calling card of the plague. In its most aggressive form, the bubonic plague could kill within days of the first symptoms appearing. But the Black Death was not content with a single form. Septicemic plague, a rarer but even more deadly variant, attacked the bloodstream, causing blood poisoning and rapid death. Victims of this form often died within hours of infection, their bodies covered in black splotches from internal bleeding. Perhaps the most terrifying form was pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs. Highly contagious, it spread through the air, carried on the coughs of the infected. Victims suffered from high fever, chest pain, and difficulty breathing, their lungs filling with bloody fluid. Death, when it came, was agonizing, a slow suffocation as the lungs filled with fluid. Chapter 4. A world-transformed social and economic upheaval. The Black Death's impact extended far beyond the immediate devastation of death. It ripped through the very fabric of medieval society, leaving a world transformed in its wake. Imagine a world where a third of the population vanishes in a few short years. Fields lie fallow, workshops stand silent, and once bustling cities are eerily quiet. This was the reality of post-plague Europe. The sudden and dramatic loss of life led to severe labor shortages, crippling agriculture and industry. With fewer hands to work the land, harvests dwindled, leading to food shortages and soaring prices. The feudal system, already under strain, began to crumble as peasants, now in high demand, found themselves with more bargaining power. The Black Death also had a profound impact on the distribution of wealth. With so many dead, inheritances were consolidated, and new opportunities arose for those who survived. The merchant class, already gaining influence, benefited from the increased demand for goods and services. The power of the church, once absolute, was also challenged as people questioned the existing social order and sought solace in new forms of spirituality. Chapter 5. Legacy of the Black Death. Echoes in art and culture. The Black Death's impact on Europe extended far beyond the immediate devastation. It reshaped societies, economies, and even the very fabric of daily life. It seeped into the collective consciousness of a continent, leaving an indelible mark on art, literature, and culture. The trauma and the sheer scale of the tragedy were reflected in the creative expressions of the time. The plague became a constant presence, a spectre haunting the works of artists, writers, and musicians. It was as if the shadow of death loomed over every brushstroke, every chisel mark, and every note played. One of the most striking artistic responses was the emergence of the danse macabre, or dance of death. This macabre theme became a popular motif in various forms of art. These allegorical depictions, often found in paintings, sculptures, and plays, portrayed figures from all walks of life, from peasants to popes, dancing with skeletons or corpses. It was a stark reminder of the inevitability of death. The message was clear. Death comes for us all, regardless of status or wealth. This universal truth was a central theme in many artistic works of the period. Literature, too, reflected the pervasive sense of mortality and the fragility of life. Writers grappled with the existential questions that the plague raised. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, a collection of novellas set against the backdrop of the plague in Florence, captured the fear, despair, and, surprisingly, the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. His work remains a poignant testament to the era. The Black Death also led to a renewed focus on the afterlife and the nature of death. People sought solace in religion, hoping for salvation and a better existence beyond this life. Religious art became preoccupied with themes of mortality, judgment, and salvation. The fear of divine retribution and the hope for redemption were vividly depicted in church frescoes and cathedral interiors. The image of the Grim Reaper, a skeletal figure wielding a scythe, emerged as a powerful symbol of death's indiscriminate reach. This figure became an enduring icon in the visual culture of the time. The plague, in its own way, forced humanity to confront its own mortality, leaving a legacy of artistic and cultural expressions that continue to resonate with us today. These echoes of the past remind us of the resilience and creativity that can emerge from even the darkest of times. Here, the enduring shadow of the Black Death. The Black Death, though a distant echo from the past, continues to captivate and horrify us. It serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of human existence and the devastating power of disease. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from the past. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest content.